Hello and good evening. This is Realpolitik Confidential episode 4 and I am your host Alex Crișan. Today it is the 11th of June 2025 and today's subject is Ice and Fire, or the battle for Los Angeles. Tonight's episode is not focused on viral clips or moral judgment. It is an analysis of a domestic security operation that escalated into a jurisdictional conflict between federal and state authorities. It will examine the role of immigration enforcement as a catalyst for civil unrest and evaluate the constitutional, logistical, and strategic implications of deploying federal troops to a U.S. city over the objection of its state governor. In doing so, we will separate signal from noise, pattern from anomaly, and identify what makes the June 2025 events in Los Angeles significant in the broader trajectory of American governance, urban resilience, and most importantly, information warfare. But first, let us discuss demographics and the legal context, or the pre-existing conditions. To understand the operational environment in which the June 2025 Los Angeles unrest occurred, we begin with basic demographic and legal context. According to the Pew Research Center and the Department of Homeland Security estimates, there are approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants residing in the United States as of early 2025. This figure has remained relatively stable since the early 2010s, fluctuating between 10.5 and 12 million, depending on methodology and enforcement trends. Of these, roughly 1.85 to 2 million reside in California, the largest concentration of undocumented individuals in any US state. For our European audience, to put things into context, that is roughly the population of the city of Bucharest, Romania's capital. Los Angeles County alone accounts for over 25% of undocumented individuals in any US state. California's undocumented population is integrated into multiple sectors: construction, hospitality, food, service, logistics, elder care, and even informal domestic labor. Most have been in the United States for over a decade. Many lived in a mixed status household, where some family members are US citizens or legal residents, while others are not. Their presence is a long-term, entrenched, and economically embedded reality. From a legal standpoint, these individuals occupy a gray zone, while unauthorized under federal immigration law, many benefit indirectly from state-level sanctuary policies, access to schooling for their children, and, depending on jurisdiction, limited public and health or housing assistance. Crucially, there exists no national pathway for regularization for these 11 million undocumented migrants. Deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA protections, remain unstable. Comprehensive reform has failed in Congress repeatedly, and this environment has fostered what can only be described as a tolerated extra-legal class, visible, essential to the economy, but perpetually vulnerable to removal. In this context, any shift in enforcement posture, especially one involving high visibility, non-criminal arrests, creates not just operational disruption but strategic political consequences. These were the pre-existing conditions going into June 2025: a saturated urban environment, a large undocumented population, weak federal to state cohesion, and deep reservoirs of accumulated fear and resentment. Now, let us discuss the enforcement action, the catalyst of these events, or better known as Operation Silent Net. On or around the 3rd of June 2025, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or more lovingly known as ICE, began a multi-day enforcement campaign across the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Internally referred to as Operation Silent Net, The operation was not publicly announced in advance and did not appear on ICE's published docket of routine enforcement activities. However, its size, coordination, and targeting parameters indicate strategic level authorization. Over the course of 5 days, ICE conducted at least 24 discrete raids across industrial zones, small businesses, and public spaces. Targets included a series of garment factories in the Fashion District, logistic warehouses near the port of Los Angeles, a grocery distribution hub in Vernon, several retail-linked day labor zones including parking lots and hardware store gathering spots, and, notably, a bilingual preschool in East Los Angeles, where multiple undocumented staff were detained. In total, 118 individuals were arrested. According to ICE press briefings held post facto, only 9 of those detained had outstanding criminal warrants. The remaining 109 were arrested on grounds of immigration status violation alone, which means unauthorized presence in the United States. This distinction is critical. Previous enforcement operations in Los Angeles, particularly during the Obama and early Trump administrations, were typically framed as criminal alien prioritizations. Operation Silent Net broke from that pattern. The choice of targets, many of them long-time residents with mixed status families, suggests a deliberate shift towards visibility enforcement. These raids are designed not primarily for disruption of criminal networks, but for optics and psychological deterrence. Sources inside advocacy networks and legal aid organizations noted that many detained had no prior interactions with law enforcement whatsoever. Several had children in local schools, and a handful were actively pursuing adjustments of status through spouses and their children. The absence of localized threat justifications suggests the operational objective was not containment but signaling. Whether this signaling was intended as a domestic political message oriented towards voters or a jurisdictional challenge to California's sanctuary policy framework, it remains speculative. What is certain is that the selection of targets produced immediate backlash, both on the ground and in the media environment. Civil society organizations began documenting arrests in real time. Protest activity outside the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles began within 36 hours of the first raid. Several clips featuring minors in distress, family members shouting, and the arrest of a prominent labor leader during a candlelight vigil went viral, triggering a rapid escalation in public response. In operational terms, the decision to conduct broad-based enforcement with low criminality thresholds in an immigrant-dense urban area during an election year created the conditions for the perfect storm. Whether that unrest was anticipated or underestimated by federal planners, it remains unclear as of today. Now let us discuss the protests which degenerated into street conflicts. By June 6, 2025, Los Angeles had moved from isolated protest to sustained street-level confrontation. The catalyst was the protest outside the Metropolitan Detention Center, or as we will later refer to it, the MDC, where the majority of Operation Silent Net detainees were being processed. Initial gatherings consisted of legal observers, clergy, immigrant rights advocates, and family members of those detained. Organizers described the action as a peaceful vigil. However, the rapid arrival of Federal Protective Services officers and DHS tactical units, reportedly in anticipation of a security breach, altered the dynamic. A key inflection point was when David Huerta, a labor leader affiliated with Service Employees International Union, was arrested. And he was also a recognized figure in California's immigrant protection ecosystem, which made things even worse. Huerta was detained while conducting a non-violent demonstration on a facility's north-facing plaza. His arrest filmed and disseminated widely, triggering an amplification loop. Local television coverage, national social media virality, and immediate mobilization from labor and student groups across the metropolitan area. Within 12 hours, the situation had escalated beyond the control of local protest organizers. On the evening of June 6th, demonstrators numbering in the thousands began marching from the embassy towards the ICE field office near North Los Angeles Street. LAPD units attempted to establish a protest perimeter, but tensions rose as demonstrators blocked intersections and attempted to cross federal barricades. Crowd control measures were employed, including tear gas, non-lethal kinetic rounds, which means basically beanbags and rubber projectiles, flashbang grenades. Multiple injuries were reported both among civilians and officers. The dynamic changed. Violence was in the air. While LAPD and city officials sought to maintain distinction between municipal law enforcement and federal actors, that separation was perceptually irrelevant on the street level. To most demonstrators, local and federal forces were functionally indistinct. Simultaneously, a secondary flashpoint emerged in the city of Paramount, a working-class suburb in southeast Los Angeles County, with a high concentration of Spanish-speaking immigrant households. A widely shared social media post claimed that ICE agents were conducting a fresh sweep at the Home Depot on Lakewood Boulevard. No such operation was ever confirmed, but the claim was sufficient to draw a large crowd within 2 hours. By dusk, approximately 500 individuals had gathered in the store parking lot. Verbal confrontation escalated into physical altercation quickly. A federal officer was reportedly injured after being struck by a metal pipe. An ICE transport vehicle was damaged and shortly thereafter incendiated, set on fire. Federal personnel deployed tear gas and withdrew. Local law enforcement secured the site and imposed an emergency curfew. From an analytical perspective, the events in Paramount represent a textbook case of information-triggered escalation, a spontaneous, decentralized protest response driven by perceived enforcement rather than actual activity. The implications are significant. When rumors, whether accurate or not, can trigger kinetic outcomes in minutes, the operational environment becomes inherently unstable. The combination of viral imagery, legitimate grievances, and tactical rumor renders crowd behavior both volatile and difficult to manage without exacerbating tensions. By the end of June 6th, federal authorities classified the situation as a multi-site unrest scenario with potential for cross-jurisdictional spillover. This classification paved the way for the next strategic decision: federal force deployment under Title 10. The Title 10 activation, or the federal power and the state resistance that emerged from this response, is significant. In response to what was formally categorized as a multi-state civil disruption, the White House initiated an emergency protocol under Title 10 of the United States Code on the morning of June 7, 2025. What is Title 10, you ask? Well, Title 10 governs the organization and deployment of U.S. armed forces. Under specific circumstances, including insurrection, rebellion, or when federal law cannot be executed by ordinary means, it grants the President of the United States authority to federalize state National Guard units and deploy active duty personnel within the U.S. borders. In this case, President Trump signed an executive directive authorizing the federalization of the California National Guard, specifically the activation of 2,000 involved in immigration enforcement. These Guard personnel were supposed to provide force protection for federal facilities and personnel involved in immigration enforcement. Crucially, this decision was made without the consent of California's Governor Gavin Newsom, marking the first time since the 1965 Selma deployments that the federal government asserted unilateral authority over states' National Guard in the absence of an insurrection declaration. The legal justification hinged on two premises. One, that the safety of federal officers, both DHS and ICE, could not be guaranteed by local law enforcement alone. And second, that the scale and duration of unrest constituted a significant disruption to federal operations, particularly regarding immigration enforcement, which is exclusively federal jurisdiction. In 24 hours, the following assets were deployed. 2,000 California National Guard troops now operating under federal command under the Title 10 status. 700 active U.S. Marines drawn from Camp Pendleton with rapid response training and limited rules of engagement. Armored transport vehicles and rotary wing surveillance platforms, or less pretentiously helicopters, assigned to perimeter patrol and convoy protection. According to the Defense Department sources, these personnel were tasked not with riot control but with guarding ICE detention and processing centers, escorting federal agents during high-risk operations, and assisting in logistics, communications, and emergency response planning in case of further escalation. The stated goal was to protect federal infrastructure and personnel. However, the optics were unambiguous. Uniformed officers, Humvees, and DHS tactical units patrolling American city streets. Politically, the move was incendiary. Governor Newsom publicly condemned the deployment, filing an emergency injunction in federal court on June 8. His administration argued that no lawful threshold for federalization had been met. The unrest did not constitute an insurrection or rebellion. The deployment undermined state sovereignty and risked inflaming tensions. The court challenge remains currently pending as of this recording. From a constitutional perspective, this raises complex issues. The Insurrection Act was not invoked. The president acted preemptively without a formal request from state officials. The Department of Defense and Department of Justice released coordinated statements affirming the legality of the deployment under Title 10, citing past precedents in Washington, D.C. and during natural disasters. However, critics argue that this use represents a functional bypass of state governance, a move that, if unchallenged, sets a significant precedent. In practical terms, the military presence did not succeed in deterring additional large-scale violence near federal facilities, but it also shifted public perception. For many citizens of Los Angeles, the streets no longer felt like their own. The federalization of Los Angeles, however temporary, marked a turning point in the relationship between immigration enforcement and civil military governance in the United States of America. At this stage, the operation was no longer strictly administrative. It had become a territorial dispute between state and federal authority, playing out in real time and under direct global scrutiny. But what does the role of information warfare and foreign amplification play in all this, you may ask? Well, by June 9, 2025, the operational and political dimensions of the Los Angeles unrest had entered a third arena: the information space. Social media platforms such as TikTok, X, formerly known as Twitter, or Instagram or Telegram, were saturated with real-time footage from protests, arrests, and troop deployments. Within 48 hours of the first ICE raid, over 140 million video views were logged under protest-related hashtags. Analysts at multiple independent cybersecurity firms noticed an uptick in coordinated amplification patterns consistent with what one might call foreign disinformation campaigns. These, for example, could include simultaneous reposting of footage with identical captions in different languages, content seeded via botnets, which are very comparable to those which had known links to Russian or Venezuelan state-aligned actors, and the usage of protest footage in non-domestic narrative frames, portraying the US as unstable, authoritarian, or internally collapsing. Several videos, including one of a minor allegedly being dragged by agents, later proven to be misidentified, were subtitled in Farsi, Russian, and simplified Mandarin, all this before trending in the United States of America. This marked a shift from prior influence operations. Rather than fabricating events, these networks focused on curating and recirculating real footage to heighten emotional response, accelerate outrage, and fragment public interpretation of events. The intent can be reasonably assessed as not to support any protest group, but to degrade institutional legitimacy, polarize public opinion, and destabilize democratic consensus. Notably, several channels linked to People's Republic of China aligned information campaigns circulated protest content with specific emphasis. The imagery of federal troops confronting Latino citizens, narratives of federal-state conflict, comparisons between U.S. protests and Hong Kong or Shanxi unrest. While not direct attribution to Chinese state cyber units, it could be reasonably confirmed that the pattern of distribution, thematic alignment with CCP messaging, and timing suggests, at minimum, an opportunistic strategic interest. In one case, a protest video showing tear gas outside the ICE field office was reposted with the headline, "Democracy or Dictatorship? US troops quell civilian uprising." From a realpolitik standpoint, this is textbook asymmetric engagement. No need to intervene kinetically, no need to fabricate. Simply amplify what is already happening. The United States in this framework becomes its own destabilizing spectacle. The strategic implication is clear. In a hyper-connected digital ecosystem, domestic crises are no longer containable. They are globalized, reframed, and repurposed in real time by actors with competing geopolitical objectives. The Los Angeles unrest thus became a data-rich test case, not only in crowd control and constitutional law, but in the vulnerability of American civil discourse to foreign influence operations. And in that domain, the line between protest and proxy conflict is thinner than many policymakers would care to admit. What is the strategic fallout, you may ask? What is the constitutional limit which was overtaken, and what is the precedent which was set? Well, to answer to those questions, the federal deployment of troops in Los Angeles under Title X authority and without the governor's consent has introduced a series of constitutional, institutional, and strategic questions that extend far beyond immigration policy. And that, at the center, is the balance of power between federal authority and state sovereignty. A legal equilibrium that has historically relied on cooperation, not confrontation. The key facts are the following. Well, no Insurrection Act declaration was actually made. The deployment was framed not as a response to rebellion, but as a measure to protect federal personnel and assets. The decision to bypass California's executive branch triggered a legal dispute now pending in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Governor Newsom's legal team argues that the threshold for federalization was not met, and that unrest, while disruptive, never exceeded what local agencies could manage. The Department of Justice, by contrast, maintains that immigration enforcement is an exclusively federal jurisdiction, and when operations are obstructed by protest, the president is authorized to ensure continuity by any lawful means. And if the courts side with the federal government, this will set a precedent for unilateral troop deployment in response to any sort of civil protest around any federal operation. This could potentially include climate actions, labor strikes, or any anti-police demonstrations. On the military side, the use of active duty Marines in a domestic law enforcement context, even in a supporting role, has triggered alarm among civil military scholars. The Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits the use of the military in domestic policing. However, under Title X, the President can authorize military assistance to civilian agencies, as long as direct law enforcement actions are not carried out. In Los Angeles, Marines did not engage in arrests. but deploy invisible deterrent postures across federal installations. The line between support and enforcement becomes difficult to maintain when optics shift public perception. In several viral images, Marines were photographed behind riot shields, standing guard under protest zones. This undermines the traditional non-partisan image of the US military that may have lasting reputational consequences. Additionally, federalized National Guard troops who often serve dual state federal functions found themselves executing federal commands in direct contradiction to their governor's political stance. The implication is structural. Future presidents, regardless of party, may now view Title X as a usable domestic governance tool. This alters the landscape of federal crisis response. Immigration raids, once seen as a law enforcement matter, have now crossed into the realm of national security architecture, complete with military deployment, executive override, and legal entrenchment. It is the normalization of extraordinary measures, a trend that, once established, is rarely reversed. In policy terms, this moment represents an evolution in the federal response model, from administrative enforcement to militarized deterrence, to precedent-setting governance under contested legal authority. Battlefield was Los Angeles, but the implications are national. And now the road ahead. What scenarios and strategic forecasts we could possibly and reasonably make? Well, as of this recording, Los Angeles remains in a state of controlled volatility. While large-scale demonstrations have temporarily subsided in the core downtown areas, tactical disruptions persist in outer districts and protest actions have decentralized. Pop-up vigils, coordinated walkouts, flash mob demonstrations, and rolling legal challenges continue. Federal facilities remain under military guard. The legal battle over Title X deployment is active. The atmosphere is not yet resolved. It is paused. It is reasonably safe to assume that protester groups are currently regrouping. We have unions, student organizations, and immigrant rights networks which have issued calls for national solidarity actions in major urban centers. Several other states, including Illinois and New York, have reported demonstrations outside ICE field offices. This is not post-crisis, this is mid-crisis. In that light, we now present revised scenario modelings. Our first scenario is escalated confrontation. Renewed enforcement operations, or even rumors thereof, could trigger a second wave of civil disruption, this time with broader interstate participation. In this scenario, military presence becomes semi-permanent in multiple cities. Federal-state relations deteriorate into opening defiance. Legal orders may be issued but ignored, and the risk of violence increases. Let us hope that this scenario will not come to pass. The second scenario is a legal stalemate and parallel governance. The federal deployment remains in place but under contested legality. Courts delay rulings, governors begin issuing counter orders challenging troop jurisdiction. Sanctuary jurisdictions move toward procedural nullification, refusing local cooperation, cutting access to public infrastructure, and in effect the country functions under divided legal realities. Our third scenario is a political realignment through crisis. The instability forces of the political actors, especially at the state level, could formalize new policy positions. National parties restructure their platforms around federalism and executive constraint. The events of Los Angeles become a turning point in constitutional interpretation akin to previous landmark disputes over desegregation, civil rights, and even Vietnam. This is the third scenario. The fourth scenario is the external manipulation expands. Adversarial information campaigns shift from amplification to orchestration. Troll farms, synthetic media, and coordinated influence operations push false narratives, escalate conflict optics, and attempt to trigger cascading unrest in cities with similar demographic and legal compositions. A hybrid warfare scenario emerges, where internal unrest is the proxy theater. All scenarios converge on a single insight. The system remains in flux, and the assumption of institutional resilience, legal, militarily, or informationally, is now under active test. From a national security standpoint, Los Angeles is no longer a jurisdictional dispute. It is a strategic terrain governed not just by law and order, but by the perceptions of legitimacy, trust, and control. In that context, what happens next is not predetermined. It depends on decisions still being made by leaders still in conflict under laws still under interpretation. Stability has not returned. It has merely been postponed. Now, for everybody's favorite segment, the big picture. Strategic, national, and geopolitical implications. Well, to conclude this episode, we now turn to the strategic overview. What this event signals beyond Los Angeles and why it matters at a national and international level. Well, the June 2025 unrest triggered by an ICE operation and federal troop deployment is not an isolated incident. It is what we would call a systemic indicator, a flashing red light in the dashboard of American governance. And let us frame the situation in 3 dimensions. First, we have the domestic strategic implications. Deployment of active duty personnel into a U.S. city over the objection of its governor signals a recalibration of federalism in practice. Title X authority, once treated as an emergency lever of last resort, is now demonstrably usable in cases of civil protest with minimal violence. That change is functional, not rhetorical. Going forward, governors will likely adopt preemptive legal strategies to limit federal encroachment. States may formalize parallel enforcement frameworks in anticipation of conflict, legal shields, administrative refusals, or logistical pushbacks. The military's domestic footprint may become politically normalized. We are now operating in a system where jurisdiction is conditional, dependent not on law alone, but on executive alignment, institutional loyalty, and strategic narrative control. This creates structural unpredictability in any future protest scenario, whether related to immigration, police authority, pandemic response, or even environmental disruption. For our second dimension, we take the national cohesion and institutional trust one. The federal response to Los Angeles has deepened the visible trust gap between state-level leadership and federal institutions. Well, as a key data point, we have a large part of Californians which most likely oppose the deployment of U.S. troops. We have military favorability, which could potentially lower in the eyes of the citizenry of California, especially in the metropolitan areas. We have immigration enforcement that is now perceived by large segments of the population as an inherently politicized institution, regardless of the legal justification. This raises a long-term risk, the erosion of a shared civic reality at the level of the United States. Because when legal actions are interpreted through partisan allegiance rather than institutional legitimacy, the governance system becomes contested in perception, even if it's still intact on paper. If left unresolved, this trend could evolve into a parallel sovereignty model, a dynamic where federal and state institutions functionally govern separately with separate populations with separate moral mandates. Historically, such fractures are prone to conflict acceleration, especially under economic duress or informational overload. And now we have the largest level. We have the geopolitical repercussions. Internationally, the United States' internal instability has strategic consequences. Adversary states and non-state actors do not need to create American dysfunction. They merely need to amplify it, exploit it, and present it as evidence of democratic decay, China, Russia, Iran, and others have all exported narrative frames built around recent US troop deployments. Think about it. Messages which may sound like America cannot manage its own territory, or civil unrest is inherent to Western decline, or federal troops now roam democratic cities. How different is this from autocracy? These frames are not persuasive because they're true. They're persuasive because they exploit existing public fatigue, confusion, and fear. Moreover, the imagery of militarized immigration enforcement plays directly into the geopolitical rivalries over human rights narratives, eroding Washington's ability to assert moral credibility in multilateral forums. From the perspective of deterrence, alliance management, and global perception, internal disorder is strategic vulnerability. The battle for Los Angeles may not shift the global balance of power, but it adds weight to the argument that internal fragmentation, not external competition, is America's primary challenge. Well, for our conclusions, and this was the longest episode that we've made so far, and it has been rather straining, so I apologize if the number of mistakes have increased. This will be the size of a regular episode from now on, so bear with me. This is the first time I'm doing this, but we will slowly get better together. But now, enough bragging, enough complaining rather than bragging. Let's discuss what it all means. The events in Los Angeles are not merely about ICE, not merely about the legality of the federal deployment, and certainly not merely about protests or public order. They're about the American systems that still possesses a center that can hold, a legal, political, and institutional architecture that can absorb stress without fracturing. What we witnessed in Los Angeles is not the beginning of a collapse, but it is a symptom of what happens when authority is contested, when coordination is absent, and when legitimacy is no longer presumed. And it is also a warning. A nation can survive dissent. A nation can even survive division. What a nation cannot survive is disbelief in its own operating system. That disbelief is growing, and what comes next will determine whether it remains contained or metastasizes. Thank you. This has been Realpolitik Confidential, Episode 4, Ice and Fire, The Battle for Los Angeles. I am Alex Crișan. Stay informed, stay analytical, stay grounded, because no institution is permanent and no republic is guaranteed. And remember our motto, which you might as well borrow in your own private life when looking at events. Less ideology and more analysis. Thank you, and have a very lovely day.